There is a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't come from anything obviously wrong. Nothing has collapsed, nothing dramatic has happened. From the outside, your life may look stable, functional, even fine. And yet internally, something feels off, subtly but persistently. This feeling often appears when your inner world has already evolved past the chapter your outer life is still living. Psychological growth doesn't wait for circumstances to catch up. It happens quietly, internally, through insight, fatigue, disillusionment, and reorganization. When that growth outpaces your environment, tension forms. Not sharp pain, but restlessness. Not crisis, but unease. You might feel confused without knowing why, anxious without a clear threat, unsettled even in places that once felt secure. This is the tension of misalignment. Nothing feels wrong, yet nothing feels right, because you are living one chapter behind who you've already become. This misalignment is difficult for the mind to tolerate because it cannot easily name it. The mind looks for problems it can solve, causes it can fix, actions it can take. But this discomfort doesn't respond to those strategies. You may try to adjust routines, change habits, think more positively, distract yourself, or push harder, only to find the feeling remains. That's because the issue isn't effort or attitude. It's congruence. Your inner values, perceptions, and limits have shifted, but your external structures haven't updated yet. You're showing up to a life that no longer reflects you accurately, and the psyche experiences that mismatch as friction. Not loud enough to force immediate action, but constant enough to demand attention. This is often why people describe this phase as feeling off rather than bad. The system is signaling that it's time for an update, even if it doesn't yet know what the update looks like. At the same time, your nervous system may be undergoing a change that feels equally confusing. After long periods of stress, vigilance, performance, or emotional overextension, the body eventually begins to exit survival mode. When that happens, calm appears, but calm doesn't always feel peaceful at first. To a system accustomed to chaos, calm can feel empty, dull, or unsettling. You may notice a strange quiet where urgency used to live. The constant inner pressure to do, fix, respond, or manage begins to fade. And instead of relief, you feel disoriented. This is because your baseline is shifting. The body is recalibrating to a state that requires less bracing, less adrenaline, less constant alertness. Peace, when it first arrives, can feel like boredom to a system that learned to equate intensity with safety. The emptiness you feel here isn't a problem. It's your body learning a new default. This recalibration often coincides with old patterns losing their grip. Habits that once structured your emotional life, overthinking, people-pleasing, conflict, self-criticism, constant striving, begin to weaken. And while that sounds positive, it can feel deeply unsettling. Repetition creates a false sense of stability. Even painful cycles provide predictability, and predictability feels safe to the nervous system. When those cycles start to collapse, the mind resists. It looks for familiar reactions to fall back on. It tries to restart the loop. But the old patterns don't work the same way anymore. The emotional charge is gone. The payoff is gone. And without repetition, the mind feels exposed. You may not know who you are without the old cycle. This is why breaking patterns feels disorienting before it feels freeing. What feels like instability is often just the collapse of repetition, the end of a pattern that once held your identity together. This leads directly into one of the most misunderstood phases of growth, being between identities. When an old identity dissolves, the new one doesn't appear immediately. There is a gap. And inside that gap, people often believe they are lost. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't feel like myself. I don't recognize what I want. The ego interprets this as failure because it cannot function without a clear self-definition. It needs labels, roles, and narratives to orient itself. But identity transitions are inherently empty. They require the old self to loosen before the new self can form. This emptiness is not regression. It's necessary space. Real change cannot happen while you are still clinging to who you were. The discomfort here comes from trying to stand on ground that no longer exists. You don't feel off because you're lost. You feel off because the old identity has already ended, and the new one hasn't finished forming. During this time, emotional detachment often increases, and this is frequently misinterpreted as indifference. You may notice that you care less about things that once consumed you. Not because you've become cold, but because you're no longer emotionally entangled in the same way. Detachment creates space for discernment. You respond instead of react. You observe instead of absorb. And while this brings relief, it can also feel unfamiliar. If your sense of aliveness was tied to emotional intensity, conflict, passion, urgency, then calm can feel like absence. But caring less does not mean caring about nothing. It means your energy is no longer automatically hooked into every stimulus. The system is becoming more selective. This selectivity is not apathy, it's maturity. And the reason it feels strange is because you've never experienced yourself without constant emotional entanglement before. Another layer of this experience comes from a decision that has already been made internally, without your conscious awareness. Many of the most important choices in life are not made with a clear moment of declaration. They are made quietly, through repeated refusals, through exhaustion, through the gradual withdrawal of energy. The psyche often decides long before the mind announces it, and during the lag between inner decision and outer movement, tension builds. You feel like you're waiting for something, but you don't know what. Clarity feels delayed, but inevitable. The discomfort comes from standing in the gap between what is already true internally and what has not yet changed externally. Life hasn't updated yet, but you have. Everything feels off because the decision is already made beneath the surface. It just hasn't been acted on or named. This is why trying to fix this phase often backfires. The mind wants resolution. It wants a plan, a label, a diagnosis, a next step. But this phase isn't asking to be fixed. It's asking to be respected. Every major transition includes a disorienting pause, a space where the old chapter is closed, but the new one hasn't fully opened. If you rush to resolve that pause, you often recreate the old chapter in a new form. You fill the space with familiar patterns just to escape uncertainty. But uncertainty here is not danger, it's transition. Learning to stay present in this gap without forcing answers is one of the most psychologically mature things you can do. If everything feels off right now, it doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're failing, regressing, or losing direction. It means you're between chapters. The discomfort is not a signal to panic. It's confirmation that the old structure has completed its role. The next chapter hasn't fully revealed itself yet because it requires space to form. And that space is exactly what you're in. What makes this phase especially disorienting is that it doesn't give you clear instructions. There's no obvious action to take, no dramatic choice demanding to be made right now. Instead, you're asked to sit inside a feeling that resists definition. The mind doesn't like that. It's trained to resolve tension through movement, explanation, or control. So when things feel off without a clear reason, the mind searches for something to blame: your habits, your mindset, your motivation, even your personality. But this discomfort isn't coming from a flaw. It's coming from timing. You are standing in a moment where your internal truth has moved ahead of your external reality, and the space between those two always feels unstable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfinished. In this gap, you may notice that your tolerance for certain things has quietly dropped. Conversations that once felt neutral now feel draining. Obligations you used to accept without question now create resistance in your body. You don't necessarily feel angry or resentful, you just feel done. This isn't impatience, it's clarity arriving before permission. Your system already knows what it can no longer carry, even if your mind hasn't built a narrative around it yet. That's why you may feel restless without wanting to escape, uncomfortable without wanting to fight, detached without wanting to disappear. The usual emotional responses don't fit anymore because the chapter they belong to is already closing internally. As the nervous system continues leaving survival mode, you may also notice a strange relationship with calm. When stress has been your baseline for a long time, calm doesn't register as safety at first. It registers as unfamiliar. The absence of urgency can feel like something is missing, as if you should be worried but aren't. This can create a low-grade anxiety that has no clear object. The body is learning to function without constant alertness, and that learning curve can feel awkward. Peace, at this stage, doesn't feel like bliss. It feels neutral, flat, almost suspicious. But neutrality is often the first step out of chronic stress. The system has to relearn how to exist without tension before it can experience genuine ease. During this recalibration, the mind may try to resurrect old patterns just to feel oriented again. It may provoke unnecessary worries, replay familiar narratives, or seek out old dynamics that once gave you a sense of identity. This isn't regression. It's the nervous system checking whether the old tools still work. When they don't create the same emotional response anymore, that's a sign something fundamental has changed. The repetition collapses not because you forced it to, but because it no longer makes sense to your system. This is where the discomfort peaks for many people. The old cycle is gone, but the new rhythm hasn't stabilized yet. You're not standing on solid ground, but you're also not falling. You're floating between structures. This is why the fear of being lost often shows up here. Without a clear identity to stand in, the ego feels exposed. It wants a label, a direction, a role it can point to and say, "This is who I am now." But identity transitions don't work that way. They require a period of unknowing. The old self has to loosen enough for the new one to emerge organically. If you rush to define yourself too quickly, you usually reach backward, borrowing language and roles from the very identity you're trying to leave. The emptiness you feel isn't a void to be filled. It's space that needs to remain open long enough for something more accurate to take shape. This is why the phase feels uncomfortable but necessary. You're not meant to resolve it immediately. You're meant to pass through it. Emotional detachment deepens this sense of unfamiliarity. You may notice that things which once stirred strong reactions now barely register. Conflicts feel optional. Opinions don't hook you the way they used to. You listen more and react less. From the outside, this can look like indifference, but internally, it feels like relief. The constant pull of emotional entanglement has loosened. You're no longer obligated to respond to every stimulus as if it defines you. This can feel strange if your identity was built around being responsive, passionate, or emotionally involved. But detachment here isn't withdrawal from life. It's a shift in how closely you fuse with it. You're gaining space between experience and reaction, and that space allows discernment to replace reflex. At the same time, you may sense that something has already been decided within you. Not consciously, not in words, but energetically. The decision shows up as a lack of appetite for certain futures. Paths that once seemed possible now feel closed, even if nothing external has changed. This can create impatience with your own life, as if you're waiting for it to catch up to a truth you already know. The psychological tension comes from this lag. Your inner world has moved on, but your outer circumstances are still catching up. That mismatch creates the feeling that everything is slightly out of sync. You're living in the aftermath of a decision that hasn't been announced yet. This is where many people try to force clarity. They look for signs, explanations, diagnoses, or immediate next steps to relieve the discomfort. But clarity doesn't always arrive on demand. Sometimes it arrives only after you've proven you can tolerate not having it. This gap between chapters is not a mistake in the process. It's the process itself. It's where the nervous system integrates change, where identity reorganizes, where values realign without being pressured into a premature form. If you rush to fix this phase, you often interrupt that integration. You trade depth for speed, certainty for truth. Learning to stay present here requires a different kind of strength. Not the strength to push forward, but the strength to stay open, to allow confusion without interpreting it as failure, to let discomfort exist without immediately anesthetizing it with distraction or action, to trust that the absence of clarity is not emptiness, but incubation. This doesn't mean doing nothing forever. It means recognizing when movement is premature. It means letting the system complete its internal work so that when movement does come, it comes cleanly. Over time, you may notice subtle shifts that don't announce themselves as breakthroughs. A growing intolerance for what feels misaligned, a quiet pull toward simplicity, a desire for fewer explanations and more honesty. These are not dramatic changes, but they are reliable signals. They indicate that the next chapter is forming beneath the surface, not as a plan, but as a direction, not as excitement, but as coherence. You may not yet know what you're moving toward, but you know what you're no longer available for, and that knowledge is often enough to begin. If everything feels off, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're in between ways of being, between identities, between chapters. The disorientation is not something to fix, it's something to respect. It's the pause that allows your outer life to eventually realign with your inner growth. The old chapter has already closed internally. The next one hasn't fully opened yet because it needs space, not pressure. And if you can allow yourself to stay present in this gap without rushing to escape it, you may find that what emerges feels less forced, less performative, and far more true than anything you could have chosen prematurely. This phase asks for patience, not answers. Honesty, not urgency. Presence, not control. And while it may feel uncomfortable, it carries a quiet reassurance within it. You are not lost. You are simply no longer where you used to be, and not yet where you're going. That in-between is not a problem. It's the passage.